Welcome to the first hearing of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety for the 118th Congress. The theme of today's hearing is living up to America's promise, the need to bolster the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and it's our goal to have a productive discussion on the historic success of America's Refugee Admissions Program and what we can and should be doing to bolster the program going into the future. I want to begin by thanking all of our witnesses for being here today and for sharing your stories, your experience, your perspective, and your work. I also want to thank Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Cornyn and their committee staff for the work that's gone into making this hearing happen. Now, since the founding of our nation, the United States has been seen as a beacon of light for people around the world, people with dreams of economic opportunity, of religious and political freedom, and of a home free from violence and conflict. And over generations, the view of America as a refuge for immigrants has been embraced across party lines. You can open up America's storybook to find a Democratic President-elect Kennedy and a Republican President Reagan invoking the same quote of Puritans setting out for New England, describing America as a city upon a hill. And here in the Senate, you can find countless examples of senators from both sides of the aisle coming together to support and defend refugees. As recently as 2019, 9 Republican senators joined with 9 Democrats to write to the Trump administration opposing the potential elimination of refugee resettlements in America. That list of senators includes many still serving in this body today, like Senators Langford, Coons, Rounds, Shaheen, Thune, and Van Hollen. I won't name them all, but just to give you a flavor of Democrats and Republicans coming together on this issue. There's many more, and we'll be submitting this particular letter that I referenced and others into the record later in the hearing. But I raise this as just one example of many that we'll hear about today that shows Americans from every background vocalizing their support for refugees. They do so because the belief in America as a welcoming nation for immigrants is embedded in what we know as the American dream, where immigrants with dreams for a better future can work hard enough and dream big enough to make it here. And while we have never fully lived up to that idea, one area where we've had remarkable bipartisan cooperation over the last half century is in our commitment to resettling refugees. The modern U.S. refugee program began with the Immigration and Nationality Act and the Refugee Act of 1980, which together established a permanent basis for refugees to be resettled each year. In the 1980s and 1990s, the number of refugees admitted into the United States on an annual basis never really fell below 61,000, and in fact reached its highest level of 207,000 in 1980. In more recent years, that number has fluctuated in the area of 56,000 and 85,000. Now, this all took a drastic turn during the Trump administration, with his clear intent to reduce the number of immigrants entering the United States. President Trump attempted to shut off all points of entry. His efforts included aggressively reducing refugee admissions, slashing the total number admitted down to around 22,500, 30,000, and finally just under 12,000 in his final 3 years in office. Now, because of these dramatic cuts, 134 resettlement offices throughout the country were shut, without enough refugees being processed to justify the costs of staff and offices. Now, during that time, conditions only worsened for millions of refugees fleeing persecution. And the COVID-19 pandemic created additional unprecedented challenges and processing refugees, as in-person screenings were delayed and increased demand for flights made refugee travel more difficult. And while the Biden administration has made efforts to rebuild and scale the refugee program back up, the Trump-era cuts and the culmination of COVID processing challenges have made it difficult to return to the typical historic annual admissions numbers. But today, according to United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there are more refugees than at any point in history. And the political situations in Afghanistan, Ukraine, and elsewhere have only made that population grow. In the coming years, we know that our changing climate will only lead to even more displacement. So we have a moral responsibility as well as the urgency to step up. While the process by which the Biden administration has expedited processing for Ukrainians and Afghans differed from the typical refugee admissions process, I hope that the urgency of the circumstances and the efficiency demonstrated over the last year and a half provide an example to follow as we search for solutions. It's important that we act thoughtfully, not just because so many people are counting on us, but because we also know the enormous value that refugees bring to our country. Past refugees are now our families, neighbors, co-workers, and in many ways critical parts of our communities. They're also a critical part of our economy. As the chart behind me shows, taken together, the spending power of all refugees and former refugees living in the United States amounts to $73 billion. They pay a combined $26 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. And they often fill critical workforce gaps, including working on the front lines during the COVID-19 pandemic in healthcare and food supply chain industries, among others. And they become so integral to our community that you don't have to look far to find a refugee who serves as the cornerstone of their community. People like Basma Alawi, a refugee who fled Iraq and became a math and science teacher teaching at a middle school in Atlantic Beach, Florida. Or Emma Yaka, an Ugandan refugee who works in the healthcare field and has dedicated himself to advocating for equal medical services for refugees. And just last week, a former refugee won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Kiwi Kwan's family fled Vietnam on a boat after the communist takeover of South Vietnam, and he spent a year in a refugee camp in Hong Kong before being admitted to the United States. On the biggest stage in Hollywood, accepting his Oscar, he said of his journey, "This is the American dream." So today, this committee is tasked with answering the question, how can we keep that dream alive? In our discussion today, I want us to be clear and focused. We are discussing refugees and the refugee resettlement process. I'm asking all members of the committee to stay focused and not distract this good faith discussion with arguments over our asylum process, which is a different legal pathway, or debates over the southern border. Today, our witnesses, our experts here, are here to discuss the refugee admission process, wherein refugees who have fled their home country for fear of persecution apply for admission to the U.S. and are thoroughly vetted outside of the U.S. before they can enter our country. And we'll be exploring that during the hearing as well. As we'll discuss, refugees are one of the most thoroughly vetted groups, having to fill out multiple forms, go through numerous interviews, and pass numerous agency vetting processes, and even go through medical screenings before they can step foot on U.S. soil. Today's discussion will be about shoring up one of the lawful pathways to come to the United States through the refugee admissions process. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all three witnesses here today, and it's my sincere hope that we can work together to get our refugee admissions process back to a standard that reflects our nation's values. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Cornyn for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Padilla, and thanks to each of our witnesses for being here today. I'm proud of this country's commitment to offering a place of refuge to people fleeing persecution on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Just over 2 years ago, I collaborated with the chairman of this committee, Senator Durbin, to hold a hearing in this subcommittee on how the United States can support Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement through our refugee policy. I also joined Senators Rubio, Coons, Tillis, Durbin, and others to encourage the Secretary of State to grant priority 2 refugee status to Uyghurs who are being persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party, basically held in concentration camps, about 1 million Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China. America should continue its tradition of welcoming refuge and resettling those fleeing oppression. President Ronald Reagan, in his first year of office, stated, "More than any other country, our strength comes from our own immigrant heritage and our capacity to welcome those from other lands." He went on, however, to say, "No free and prosperous nation by itself can accommodate all those who seek a better life or flee persecution. We must share this responsibility with other countries," and that's what the Refugee Resettlement Program does. No refugee can self-select their coming to the United States. They can be resettled in a number of other countries. All free nations need to share that commitment, but we should not lose sight of the fact that the refugee system is fundamentally about providing a path to safety, not necessarily a path to the United States. Furthermore, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is not the solution to the chaos and the crisis that we see on our southern border. In January, President Biden announced a new measure to address the border crisis, including a provision that would welcome up to 20,000 refugees from Latin America and Caribbean countries during fiscal years 2023 and 2024. I understand that the administration's new strategy includes other components as well, most of which I believe will merely camouflage the severity of the problem we're experiencing. But let's be clear. Increasing refugee resettlement is not the solution to what we see on the border happening today. In each of the last 2 fiscal years, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered 1.3 million migrants from Mexico and Northern Triangle countries. So at the pace of 20,000, this is a drop in the bucket. It will not alleviate the strain caused by the current crisis on our southern border, and it will not prevent migrants with weak or non-existent asylum claims from unlawfully crossing the border. The solution to the crisis lies in enforcing our immigration laws and deterring migrants from undertaking the dangerous journey to the southern border when they do not have a valid basis for asylum. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has not shown a willingness to quickly remove migrants with frivolous or no asylum claims. So there's just simply no consequences associated with coming here, claiming asylum, being released into the interior of the country, perhaps never to be heard from again. Certainly, the administration has taken 0 efforts to actually, once people fail to show up for their asylum hearing, assuming they can get one in a reasonable period of time, those who don't qualify, there is no program or system for removal of those individuals who don't meet the legal threshold for asylum. Just last week, the New York Post reported that a migrant who was paroled, which means in this context to be released into the United States to await a future court hearing, the New York Post reported that a migrant who is paroled in New York City today will have to wait until October 2032 to receive his or her notice to appear, which starts the immigration court process. That's a 10-year wait to even begin the process. Meanwhile, that individual's set down roots, perhaps married, has children, and it is a disservice to those with valid asylum claims to make them wait so long when 85% or so of the individuals who do actually present in front of an immigration judge do not qualify. It's unfair to those who do qualify. Paroling a migrant into the United States and waiting nearly a decade to start deciding whether or not he or she has a valid asylum claim is absurd. But that's just another consequence of the current policy by this administration at the border. I think this stands in stark contrast to the sober, deliberate process of considering refugee applications through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. But you look at the number that President Biden's administration has set for the cap for a year, it's 125,000. During the first 2.5 years of the Biden administration, we've seen 5 million migrants show up at our southern border. So 125,000 is not a significant number when considered in that context. But the process is sound, I believe. Applicants for the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program undergo multiple rounds of interviews and submit to multiple and continuous background checks to determine whether or not they pose a safety or security risk to the United States. Their biographic and biometric information is checked against the U.S. Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, FBI, and National Counterterrorism Center holdings. And there's a randomness factor, too. The likelihood that any individual refugee will be sent to the United States is low, so low that it is a poor vehicle for terror groups of those who intentionally want to come to the United States to do so. It's a whole lot easier to show up on the border and claim asylum and then be paroled under current policies into the United States. So I don't believe the refugee resettlement program represents a substantial safety risk, but I'm anxious to hear what the witnesses have to say. When a refugee is finally admitted to the United States, he or she is qualified as a refugee. Although no system is perfect, we've taken significant measures to screen out those who would seek to do us harm or come lying about or misrepresenting their circumstances. So again, this stands in sharp contrast to the chaos we see at the southern border. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, more than 800,000 migrants have been paroled into the United States. Again, this is the process by which they show up. They're given a notice to appear or told to report for a future court hearing, but then released into the interior of the United States. Again, and only a small percentage, maybe 15%, ultimately qualify, and many don't show up for a court hearing, but there's never a process, a systematic way to try to remove those who do not qualify, even if they don't show up. We will not begin to decide whether they qualify for asylum for years. In some cases, as I said, more than a decade, but we know historically that about 85% do not qualify for asylum. And again, if you think about the unfairness to people who actually do, making them wait for 10 years before actually getting an asylum hearing because of the backlog caused by people who do not qualify is very unfair. Security screenings for migrants at the border does not even begin to approach the rigorous process refugees undergo. True, Border Patrol has successfully screened out some criminals and individuals who matched records on the terrorist screening data set. And I look forward to asking General Burns about his experience. And the numbers are increasing. In 2020, Border Patrol apprehended only 3 individuals who matched records on the terrorist screening data set. That number has increased to 15 in fiscal year 2021, to 98 in 2022, and 69 so far in 2023. In other words, in 2023, 69 people so far who were apprehended, we're not talking about the gotaways, the ones that were apprehended, were on the terrorist screening watch list. Well, in fiscal year 2022, we don't have an exact number, but it's estimated that there are about 600,000 migrants who did not run to the Border Patrol to claim asylum. They ran away from the Border Patrol because, frankly, they knew they couldn't qualify, or they knew that they were transporting drugs, or for some other reason they would not be able to legally make it into the United States. Recent estimates in the media place this number for fiscal 2023 at more than 350,000 gotaways so far. I recently was in El Paso with some colleagues at a night patrol where they detained 2 gentlemen from the People's Republic of China. This is El Paso, Texas. The People's Republic of China is a long way away. And we don't really know why they decided to come to El Paso, Texas, or what they will do once they are paroled into the United States awaiting an immigration court hearing. We should, together with the rest of the world, offer protection to victims of persecution. There's no difference between us on that score, but allowing chaos to persist at the southern border is counterproductive, to say the least. The Biden administration can do better and must do better. We need a safe, orderly, humane, and legal system for people to come to the United States. I believe we have that in the Refugee Resettlement Program. We do not have it at the southern border, thanks to the administration's failed policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Thank you for recognizing the distinction. And again, today's hearing is focused on the Refugee Admissions Program and Settlement Process. I want to welcome Senator Welch to today's hearing. We'll acknowledge other members as they arrive. But let's proceed now with witness introductions. Then we'll swear in the witnesses and begin. After I introduce and swear in the witnesses, they will each have 5 minutes to offer opening remarks. We will then begin our first round of questions, and each senator will have 5 minutes. So I'd like to begin with Mr. Dawda Cisse. Mr. Cisse is the National Network Director of African Communities Together and Vice Chair of the Refugee Congress Board of Directors. Mr. Cisse fled Sierra Leone at age 16 due to a brutal war and was in a refugee camp in the Gambia for nearly 10 years before he was resettled in the United States. Today, he serves as National Network Director for African Communities Together and is a founding member and president of the Louisiana Organization for Refugees and Immigrants, a nonprofit community-based organization that assists refugees and immigrants through their various stages of integration into the United States. Mr. Cisse is also a member of the Mayor Sharon Weston Broome International Relations Commission and chairperson of the Commission on Culture and Art Engagement, a commission established to help make the city of Baton Rouge more inclusive and welcoming. He was recently appointed as the first refugee to serve as U.S. advisor at the UNHCR high-level officials meeting on global impact on refugees in December of 2021, and on the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement in June 2022. Most recently, he was among the first advisors to serve on the United States Refugee Advisory Board. We also welcome Mr. Bill Canny. Mr. Canny has served as Executive Director of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Department of Migration and Refugee Services since 2015. In this capacity, he is responsible for all of the Department of Migration and Refugee Services operations, including its role as National Refugee Resettlement Agency and its programs for unaccompanied migrant children and unaccompanied refugee minors. Mr. Canny has an impressive career history that spans from Catholic Relief Services to the International Catholic Migration Commission in Geneva to the Papal Foundation. He has managed and executed relief and development operations in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. He oversaw programs in war-torn Kosovo, Albania, Afghanistan, Indonesia, and East Timor, as well as refugee processing in Thailand, Croatia, and Turkey. He has also advocated internationally in support of rights-based policies and long-term solutions in collaboration with Catholic bishops' conferences around the world. And I'll now turn it over to Senator Cornyn to introduce General Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce Brigadier General Christopher Burns, who's retired from the United States Army. General Burns completed 36 years of service to our country, culminating as the Commander of Special Operations Command North at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. In 1987, he was commissioned as a distinguished graduate of the ROTC program at the University of Connecticut. Following his training to become a U.S. Army Special Forces officer in Rhode Island, he spent 36 years, as I said, working in numerous theater special operation commands, Joint Special Operations Task Force, U.S. Special Operations Command, and the Joint Staff. He's been previously deployed in staff and command positions in support of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Thank you for your service, General, and welcome.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I'll ask each of the witnesses to please rise and raise your right hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect all witnesses have acknowledged in the affirmative. And with that, let's begin with witness testimony, starting with Mr. Cisse.
Chairman Padilla, Ranking Member Cornyn, honorable members of the Judiciary Committee, I humbly greet you all in my special way. And I want to thank you for holding this crucial and timely hearing. My name is Dauda Cisse. My wife, daughter, and I came to the United States as a refugee from Sierra Leone in 2009. I am deeply honored for the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee because one of my personal connection to the Refugee Resettlement Program and to express my gratitude to my fellow Americans for welcoming me and others like me to this country. In the 1990s, my country, Sierra Leone, was violently attacked in one of the bloodiest civil wars that resulted in over 70,000 people being killed and almost 2.5 million people displaced. That war was defined by widespread atrocities, including amputations, child soldiers, pregnant women undergoing brutal stillbirths, family bonds our lives, including mine. So many children like me had to endure these atrocities. At a young age, I had an aspirations and dreams to study medicine and become a gynecologist or a pediatrician because my country at that time had the highest and continue to have the highest infant mortality rates. But all my aspirational goals were shattered. At the age of 16, I was forced to leave everything behind after armed rebels attacked my hometown. On that day after school, I remembered playing with my friends outside my father's work complex, waiting for our parents when armed rebels attacked. There were gunshots everywhere. Armed men stormed the complex, capturing 9 of us. They placed us in line for our hands to be chopped off. Using the slogan, "Do you want long sleeve?" That means your hands will be cut here. "Do you want short sleeve?" Hands will be cut here. In an unspeakable horror, I watched 5 of my childhood friends' hands were amputated. A portion of my hands were almost cut off, and I got shot in my leg. In the midst of that, my dad came out pleading for our release. but sadly and painfully, he was killed. My father is a true hero. He died in front of me and my friends, and he gave his life to protect us and what was left for our community. When I regained consciousness, I later learned in an internal displaced camp that my family house was set on fire, with my mom, siblings, and other relatives inside. My mom survived, but horrifically, my 7-year-old sister, an innocent baby, was burnt alive. That was a sad fact I learned when I reconnect with my mom decades later. And I remember during one of my conversations with my mom, she said, "I am hopeful that I will see my husband again." That's my dad. Said that same faith that brought us together, that same faith will bring him back. It was in that moment I realized that she didn't know that Dad was killed. I had to tell her the breaking news, the heartbreaking news. Like so many refugees like me, I would have preferred to stay or remain in my homeland. However, due to the constant fear of persecution and the brutal war that took away my loved one, I had no other choice but to leave. The refugee program was my only hope. While I met my beautiful wife, who is here today with me, and my daughter in a refugee camp, life there was very tough. We lived in a plastic tent, crowded in one big space with no privacy or sense of dignity. As one of the fortunate refugees considered for resettlement, we had to undergo many background checks, and I spent almost 10 years in the refugee camp, even with my medical conditions, before I was finally resettled in Baton Rouge. The screening process was vigorous, and there were no shortcuts. After experiencing short suffering in the refugee camp, I faced post-resettlement challenges once I arrived in the United States, such as dealing with discrimination, language barriers, and learning a new way of life. My community members in Louisiana, and one of them is here as well with me today, helped me to get through these hardships. I enrolled in college and earned an associate degree in applied science in process technology and worked at Dow Chemical for over 7 years. Today, I work with refugees and immigrants as the National Network Director at African Communities Together. I also founded the Louisiana Organization for Refugees and Immigrants, LORI, and a vice chair, the Board of Directors, Refugee Congress. In my work, I see firsthand the resettlement program face serious challenges as it struggled to regain capacity. I encourage Congress, as I'm here today, to reaffirm its commitment to refugees by passing the Refugee Protection Act. as someone who knows firsthand the horror that causes individuals to flee and the sense of hope that finding a home brings, I am compelled to share my experience to you all today so that I can help Congress make an informed decision and ask you to help restore and strengthen this life-saving resettlement program, a program I came through to help me be part of the fabric of these great nations. Thank you again for your time and consideration. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your powerful story. Now turn to Brigadier General Burns for your testimony.
Chairman Padilla, Ranking Member Cornyn, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you to discuss the Refugee Admission Program. My testimony today examines the current refugee challenges through the lens of someone who has looked at this problem from a whole-of-government approach as the former Commanding General of Special Operations Command North, and prior to that as the Assistant Commanding General for Special Operations Central Command. This experience includes 36 years of service to the nation and experiencing refugee challenges firsthand around the world. My testimony today is my own opinion based on those years of experience and does not represent the opinion or policy of anyone else. My goal today is to hopefully bring to you a new set of perspectives and possible points to consider as you ponder the path forward on this very challenging issue. The first portion of my testimony will focus on the U.S. Refugee Admission Program. It has been around for some time and is shown to be an underutilized but effective program. It is thoughtfully designed and does the due diligence that is needed to ensure that the persons claiming refugee status are indeed a valid entrant to the program. That is, that the applicants are truly persecuted on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, and that they do not pose a national security threat to the United States. This program allows the United States government to manage through a deliberate process, which in turn leads to the best forecasted outcomes, since it is a planned program. As noted, President Biden increased the number from 15,000 per year to 125,000 per year, although the administration's projected last year admissions were only 23 to 25,000. This committee has, on the whole, expressed support for helping victims of persecution through the Refugee Admissions Program. I could not agree more that this is the right way to bring in refugees who have a strong desire to be U.S. citizens. In contrast to this orderly, deliberative process of screening refugees through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the current situation on the southern border poses a risk to our safety and national security. Many of the migrants who have crossed the border and claimed asylum do not meet the qualifications, the same standard that applies to refugees, and desire to enter the country for economic, medical reasons, or being trafficked as slaves, sex workers, organ harvesting, drug mules, dealers, criminals on a terrorist watch list, or cartel elements. There are other reasons, but the key point is that for most, they are looking at what is the easiest way to enter the country. Some have noble reasons, some do not. This has led to many refugees taking the easy wrong versus the hard right of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Some are convinced by cartels that the cartel's way is the best way because it is cheaper process and they guarantee that you will get in or they will cross you again. Some of the people are trafficked in and the cartels own them as they pay off the cost of their entry. This factor, combined with the people who do not qualify for asylum, leads to a huge demand for the cartel model of entering the country. The Biden administration has announced its intent to triple refugee resettlement for the Western Hemisphere through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. If we don't take serious action to deter the migrants from taking the wrong way and placing their lot with the cartel, this approach will not have its intended results. It's worth pointing out that these illicit pathways have existed for decades, and the only thing that changes is the commodity that passes through them. When I was the SOC North commander, we saw a lot of human trafficking because that was where the money was. Drugs had declined because they had become less profitable than human trafficking. Fentanyl was just starting to rise and was a concern for us given the ease of production and movement that was on the horizon. I think a point that can be made is that the size of the breakage rate of seizure of drugs is in proportion to the amount coming across. A large seizure means more coming across on a net basis. The best approach is to look at the cartels as a business, and they are going to move whatever commodity makes them the most money. And when that dries up, they will look at other means to generate revenue, just like business. We are competing against a well-marketed program with global reach that is cheaper, faster, and has a guaranteed deliver and is highly adaptable. So for our program to be the program that is selected, we need to make it more attractive and also increase the difficulty of the illicit pathways. This will not be easy given the impressive track record of the cartels. They have getting people and commodities into the United States. Some things to consider as you look to increase security on the southern border and protect those who are truly persecuted. Vetting needs to happen outside the country to ensure the right people enter. Our system is not designed to quickly net large numbers of migrants on the border for the veracity of their asylum claims and then potentially criminal background and national security threat. Understand it is a business for the cartels, and whatever action you take, they will counter to make money. That may be a different commodity or some action inside the United States that will generate revenue with those that are indebted to them. They are in the business of making money. A lot of disinformation is fed to those who try to transit through the border on social media, word of mouth, etc. Innovation is also taking away many lower entry-level jobs here in the United States. We need to bring in people who need our help, but we can also provide a path to success for them. If you look at Amazon Market and McDonald's, those are two examples of where a reduced number of lower entry jobs are available, and you're just typing in your order. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. If the changes you make are working, you will see a decrease in the illegal entries, and we will be able to offer refugees to the truly persecuted. If not, try something else and realize that you have a competitor who's got a market share and will adjust. From a global perspective, we need to make sure that failed states can get their national talent back and not keep them. If not, we'll be creating an ungoverned space that various actors will exploit. And as someone who is out there, one of the greatest fears we have is as they leave those countries, as you just said, you wanted to stay, but you can't. So how do you reconstitute that state and it becomes a failed state? So we need to be cognizant of the fact that we also need to not create a brain drain in that process as we do that. I thank you for your time and look forward to any questions you might I'd be able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll buy him a minute while he takes a sip of water. We'll now hear from Mr. Canny.
Thank you, Chairman Padilla, Ranking Member Cornyn, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing and providing me with the opportunity to testify. I have had the privilege of leading migration and refugee services at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for the past 7 years. During that period and over the course of my career, I have witnessed the refugee admissions program at its highest and lowest points. With each, I have only grown in my appreciation for the program, its life-saving impact, and all those who work to make it one of the most successful human enterprises in human history. In 1980, Congress standardized the process of resettlement and established the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP. The USCCB became one of the original resettlement agencies for USRAP, building on decades of prior experience, helping refugees integrate into American communities. Historically, the USCCB has been the largest of these organizations. This reflects the Catholic Church's long-standing commitment to welcoming newcomers and protecting the life and dignity of our most vulnerable brothers and sisters. Our work is motivated by the gospel, which calls us to welcome the stranger as we would Christ and see him in all those we serve. Much about our country and our world has changed since 1980, but the Refugee Admissions Program remains true to its roots, an expansive public-private partnership supported by a diverse group of faith-based organizations alongside a number of secular partners. Local agencies and communities across 48 states play a crucial role in welcoming refugees. Meanwhile, those resettled through USRAP continue to be some of the most vulnerable and robustly vetted refugees in the world. In 2020, we commemorated the 40th anniversary of USRAP. Unfortunately, 1 year later, we observed another milestone, an all-time low number of annual admissions, with fewer than 12,000 refugees admitted that year. This pales in comparison to the historical average of about 80,000 annual admissions, spanning both Republican and Democratic administrations. In large part, this decline can be attributed to policies put in place by the prior administration, combined with the devastating toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, this program and those who support its operation have demonstrated a strong resolve and a capacity to adapt. There is perhaps no better illustration of this than the Herculean effort undertaken by the resettlement community to welcome almost 80,000 Afghans over the span of 7 months in 2021 and 2022. This could not have been accomplished without the steadfast support and participation of Americans from all walks of life, including many veterans and veterans organizations. While many of these Afghans have already become integral members of our new communities, as humanitarian parolees, they lack the certainty provided to those with refugee status. There remains an urgent need for Congress to pass the bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act. In many ways, USRAP is at a crossroads. The program has been slow to rebuild processing infrastructure, and significant case backlogs continue to delay resettlement and family reunification. So far this fiscal year, out of a possible 125,000 admissions based on the presidential determination, less than 15,000 refugees have been admitted to the United States, excluding, of course, Afghan and Ukrainian parolees who are also served by the resettlement agencies. That said, there is much opportunity to innovate and improve efficiency within the program. The current administration has made some steps forward in this regard, but Congress's continued commitment, oversight, and investment are needed. Early in his presidency, Ronald Reagan described refugee policy as, and I quote, an important part of our past and fundamental to our national interest. President Reagan recognized that in resettling refugees, we further our reputation as a nation of opportunity, a beacon of hope, and an adversary of oppression, while at the same time advancing our national security and foreign policy objectives. Over the past 40 years, a strong bipartisan majority of Congress has shared this view. With record levels of forced displacement around the globe, it is my hope and prayer that you will join with communities across our country in bolstering this program for the next 40 years and beyond. Thank you again. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Canny, and to all of you for your opening statements. We will now proceed to questions from the committee. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Canny for some help. I think there's often confusion among the various ways individuals fleeing persecution can enter the United States. Oftentimes, refugees and asylum seekers are conflated. Now, many times it's unintentional. Sometimes it's very intentional. In addition, with the recent surge in Afghan and Ukrainian arrivals through the parole process, the different pathways into the United States has gotten even more complex. One thing is clear, though. These are all lawful and unique pathways for individuals and families to come to the United States and seek safety. So, Mr. Canny, can you spend a minute just explaining the differences between asylum, refugees, and parolees so we can ensure that the focus of this hearing remains, as I mentioned at the outset, on the refugee process specifically?
So a refugee, in the context of this program, is generally referred to the United States by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. They've been determined to have refugee status by the UN, but they go through a process outside of the country, and they're often in either refugee camps or other parts of cities outside of the country, a process of vetting, process of determining if they meet the criteria, are they a threat, et cetera, and through that process are admitted or rejected to the program. An asylum seeker comes into the country and at that point makes a case for their own persecution, which is similar to a refugee, but a case for their own persecution or the possibility of persecution before courts while they were in the country. A parolee, oftentimes referred to as a humanitarian parolee, comes on a parolee visa. They are allowed in for humanitarian purposes. also for perhaps the good of the United States as it may be determined. And they come in and they are allowed in for a short period of time, usually in these recent instances, 2 years, perhaps 1, and they are here for a short period of time with no guarantee of a path towards residency in the United States. So those are the three distinctions.
Thank you. Very helpful and useful here. So how is the program going? I think we've laid out some history through our opening statements. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program has, on average, admitted 80,000 annually since 1980. And it has only been since 2017 that the number has dropped significantly. The Trump administration's severe cuts to the number of refugees admitted into the U.S., even though the program had enjoyed robust bipartisan support for nearly 4 decades, and despite the fact that through this program, refugees can enter the United States with arguably the most significant vetting process in place. Then COVID-19 dramatically limited the ability of refugees to be processed, as USCIS officers could not go abroad to interview them. So COVID offered additional challenges. While the Biden administration has set the refugee ceiling number at 62,500 for fiscal year 2021 and 125,000 for fiscal year 2022, only 11,411 and 25,465 were admitted in those years respectively, creating this significant gap between the cap and the actual number admitted, again, as the chart behind me demonstrates. So, question for Mr. Candy, can you discuss what challenges the Biden administration has faced in rebuilding the refugee program and what actions the administration can take to resettle closer to that 125,000 number of refugees by the end of fiscal year 2024?
The challenges have been many, but they've been primarily, I would say, staffing particularly with DHS, USCIS, refugee officers who, by the way, are well-trained once they are hired and trained to go out and do the work. They have not had enough, due to staffing primarily, circuit rides to go out and adjudicate refugees. They've been slow to restaff refugee processing centers, the 7 that we have overseas, to get them again staffed up to adjudicate the numbers of refugees that we would like to get into this process. They've also been, I would say, distracted for good purposes with the Afghan evacuation, and the system was forced to focus on the 80,000 Afghans that came in. I'm proud to say that our government and our communities and the nonprofits that worked in that did a fantastic job. That was, at sort of the expense to a degree of getting other refugees into the country through the pipeline to reach the 125,000 that you mentioned. I think the security vetting that they've inherited from the Trump administration and previously, I think needs to be looked at again. My concern, and I'm not an expert, but that some of the vetting that was put into place by the last administration may not be as meaningful as it should be. It could also have some processes that are duplicative. I think we need to look at those processes of duplication also in order to get this pipeline moving in the pace that we need to complete 125,000 by 2024.
Thank you very much. Senator Cornyn.
As I said at the beginning, I think the refugee resettlement program is a good model. And for a variety of reasons, I think it works, and certainly willing to work with my colleagues in the administration in making sure that more people get access to this program. But I'm struck, General Burns, by the differences that Mr. Canny described, and I'm going to ask him a little bit about it too. It is confusing between refugees and people seeking asylum, and then those who simply come in, let's say, to the border, and if you're an unaccompanied child, there's another process. There are the gotaways. It's a hodgepodge of different programs and different ways into the United States. But it strikes me, General, that the protections that, for example, Mr. Cisse and his family went through in terms of vetting and that sort of thing, that it's completely absent when it comes to people who show up on the border from anywhere around the world and simply make a claim for asylum. I think Mr. Canny said the test is basically the same, credible fear, persecution for these various categories. But because of the volume of people coming across, they're simply released into the interior and given a notice to appear for a future court hearing. So in the refugee program, it seems like there's significant vetting. There's no self-selection process. My understanding is about 35 countries are accept the vast majority of these refugees. So somebody can't say, I'm a refugee, I want to go to the United States. They get assigned to one of these countries. Certainly the numbers are dramatically different, 125,000 cap for refugees, and as I mentioned, about 5 million migrants have presented at the border in the time that President Biden has been in office. And then, of course, there's the fact that there's a lawful process for refugees, and the process by which people present at the border is largely in the hands of transnational criminal organizations that care about nothing but money. I've heard it expressed that they are something this way, that they are commodity agnostic. In other words, anything that makes them money, they will do. Arms, sex trafficking, drugs, and the like. So, as I said at the beginning, I support a safe, orderly, legal, and humane system for legal immigration, for refugee replacement, but that's not what we're seeing at the border. And then finally, General, you talk about the global reach of this problem. I was in El Paso recently on a night patrol with the Border Patrol, and we had 2 young men presenting with passports from the People's Republic of China. And how they got to El Paso, I don't know. And what they did once they were released, nobody knows. So do you consider the current chaos and lawlessness associated with what's happening at the border to be a national security risk?
Yes, Senator, I do, and I think you kind of draw out the point that if we have a consistent vetting process, because if they're all going to enter the United States, you would want to have a consistent process for that entry to make sure that nefarious actors do not enter the United States or people that don't meet the criteria that we have. And the challenge we have is that without that consistent vetting, you have what we used to call when I was a young lieutenant, the challenge between speed and security. So you have a very large number jamming up the system. You need to get them worked through the process. So security gets reduced to get the speed through that process. So whereas if you could have a consistent vetting process for all, then you would know you were in a good shape or a better shape. Everything has an error rate, but at least you would have a consistent process to follow. And also you would create friction for the cartels in terms of how they'd be able to get it through. And as I said in my opening comments, the problem right now is the cheapest way into the United States is through the cartels. And it's a little bit euphemistic, but you could almost argue they're the largest travel agency in the world in terms of processing people through. As you mentioned, with people from China, they come from all over the globe because it's the easiest way to get in with the lowest bar. So, but if we have a criteria vetting that is standard, we can handle that process and look through that. And then I would say the other challenge is just supporting them as they come through the process as well to make sure we put them in the right place economically, though, so they can be successful.
If the chairman will allow me, I have just one quick yes or no question for Mr. Cisse and Mr. Canny. The administration, the Biden administration, has recently proposed a rule they call the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways rule that purports to establish a rebuttable presumption against asylees, in other words, a presumption of ineligibility for asylum for migrants who don't follow certain prescribed pathways. Mr. Cisse, are you familiar with that proposed rule, and do you support it or oppose it?
Thank you so much for your questions. I've heard about the ruling, and when one thing I know for sure, when individuals seeking protections, they have that credible fear, like what my family experienced. If I am in that situation, and America is the closest place, what I experience, I will definitely run and get to that place for safety. Because I always say this to people, like refugees, you are running when the grass under you is burning.
So you would oppose a rule that has a presumption of ineligibility for asylum?
I don't know the detail of that, but
Okay, that's fair enough.
yeah.
Mr. Kenny, are you familiar with the proposed rule? And
Not familiar with the rules.
Okay,
such
I'm
that I can
striking
speak
out.
about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for coming in today. I'm from Rhode Island, and we have a pretty robust refugee program with over 1,000 refugees and parolees that have been welcomed to Rhode Island shores. We could, of course, be doing more, but we have a very long tradition of this, beginning with Hmong and other Southeast Asian communities coming to Rhode Island in the wake of the Vietnam War. And so it's been, there's a lot of community support, a lot of goodwill. We have organizations like one that takes folks in when they arrive, gets them language support, gives them an immediate job, trains them up so that they can go elsewhere in the workforce. And our church communities are very, very strong in this, Mr. Canny, you'll be glad to hear. I understand that over a 10-year span, the Department of Health and Human Services has calculated that U.S. refugee resettlement brought in $63 billion more in government revenues than it cost. So this looks like it's a net winner for us fiscally as well as culturally and from a humanitarian perspective. Mr. Kenny, what would the most useful things be that we could do to undo some of the damage done to the refugee resettlement program during the Trump administration and encourage all of this benefit?
Senator, thank you. A number of things are staff up, certainly the organizations, USCIS, PRM, to go out and adjudicate cases, staff up the refugee processing centers, certainly consider enlarging the number of processing centers. I would say looking at getting one into Pakistan would be critical to saving thousands of Afghans who are currently in Pakistan without a path out of there, without a refugee processing center or some form of means to be adjudicated. Further, take a look at vetting, make sure it's meaningful, make sure that you know the things that have been put in the last couple of years are not slowing the process down unnecessarily while guaranteeing our national security and safety. So taking a look at vetting from that perspective would be another thing that can be done. The Central American Minor Program is stalled a bit. I think it needs a push by the administration to go out and educate people on the possibilities they have to come into the country. Perhaps getting some NGOs out there to again provide information and education would be another aspect I think that would be important to increasing the number of people. The administration is doing this. This is not easy. Looking back at cases that have gone into sort of the black hole, sometimes termed, where People are dinged for a security reason, but there's no follow-up to determine if it was valid or not. I think that would be an important aspect in order to help tens of thousands of people in that particular position to have a relook at their cases, because in fairness. So those are some of the things that I would recommend the administration do, Senator.
Terrific. Well, that's a very helpful punch list, and I appreciate it. I would surmise that beyond the $63 billion calculable dollars that this program benefits us by, there's also a very significant benefit to our country from presenting an example of decency and refuge in the world. And I don't know how you can put a price on that, but I think Vladimir Putin is finding out the cost of doing the opposite when you are setting an example of brutality and criminality in the world. So nice to have this as a polar opposite to that kind of behavior, and I thank the chairman for the hearing.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Welch.
I thank the chairman for the hearing. I'm just going to make a few comments because I was able to sit through the wonderful testimony of all three of these gentlemen. Number one, I strongly support the U.S. refugee program. Number two, we have a real problem at the southern border. So, Senator Thune, the comments you made in the trip that you invited me on, where we were exposed to just the reality of the challenges of 2 million people showing up, that's real, and we've got to deal with it. But that's a different situation than what many of the refugees have. It's entirely different. Mr. Sesay's testimony shows that. He was not a person who wanted to leave his home. He wanted to stay in his home, and he had people with guns showing up ready to chop his hand off. That's different. And General, to some extent, I think in your testimony, many of the good points you made shouldn't be conflated with the situation at the southern border and the situation in Sierra Leone. And that's the point that I think is so important. The southern border situation has to be dealt with. But I get worried at times that the failure of us to deal with the southern border becomes an impediment to us to deal with a separate situation that has its own independent reality and can be resolved. So this hearing was extremely helpful to me, where we could hear about the unique situation that so many refugees have. They're by and large people who are really dedicated to their communities. The grass is burning under them, and that's the reason that they're running. And all of us would want to be welcoming in that situation. That's different than a really serious situation at the southern border that hopefully this committee will help address. And I just want to, again, thank Senator Cornyn for inviting me on, an early Codell to get exposed to that. But I just want to reassert that I fully support the U.S. refugee program. Vermont supports it. Senator Leahy, my predecessor, was a champion of this program, and I thank you for this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Coons.
Sitting out here, but that's okay. Go ahead. Thank you. Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman. To Chairman Padilla and to Ranking Member Cornyn, thank you for convening this hearing, and to the three witnesses today, thank you for sharing your compelling personal testimony, your experience, and your service to our nation. This is a problem that should not be as complex to solve and as difficult and enduring as it is. As some of you have heard me say, my own interest in and exposure to refugees began when I was in middle school, and my mother and many of the other women of our church offered to host a refugee family from South Vietnam. They'd been separated during the war. The head of household had fought for the Army of South Vietnam and had been taken to a re-education camp. His wife and children had fled to Thailand. And when he eventually escaped, he walked from Vietnam all the way through Cambodia to Thailand and was reunited with his family, was picked up by the U.S. Navy off the South China Sea. And they became a wonderful member of our community. This family thrived in the United States and is a great example, I think, of the real and concrete benefits. This is not just our opening our hearts and our country, but welcoming people of enormous creativity who make tremendous contributions. In 2019, Senator Lankford and I led a letter with 18 senators urging the previous administration to reaffirm the fundamental importance of the U.S. refugee program for our foreign policy, economic vitality, and our core commitment to human rights. And in this spirit, Senator Klobuchar and I led an effort that she worked harder on and was more effective on than I was, to get the Afghan Adjustment Act passed. At the end of the last Congress, it had 10 bipartisan co-sponsors. And it is an effort similarly to honor the service and sacrifice of those who served alongside us and who I think deserve a legal status here. This past weekend, as Senator Welch just referenced, Senator Cornyn and I and a bipartisan group of House and Senate members met with President Lopez Obrador in Mexico City, met with both our national security and foreign policy leaders at our embassy and all the various cabinet members of the Mexican government to talk about the flow of guns south, the flow of fentanyl north, security along the border, the prospect of economic development jointly, but in many ways at the very center of it, this question of how do we come up with a safe, orderly, legal, and humane system. I appreciate the administration taking some bold steps to try things that haven't worked before. They have seen some significant progress, but at the end of the day, this can only really be fixed by legislative action by Congress, not by executive orders by the president, as significant as they may be, as impactful as they might be. Let me ask two quick questions, if I might. Mr. Sese, thank you for your testimony and for your advocacy on behalf of Americans like you who've experienced what you did in Sierra Leone and in Gambia. What have you learned in Baton Rouge about the local community's willingness to welcome refugees and the recognition of the value that you bring?
Thank you so much, Senators. And thank you for reaffirming your commitment to the refugee resettlement process. There are so many that I can mention here that are along my experience in, not just in Baton Rouge, in Louisiana as a whole. And as I mentioned earlier, the challenges that I faced in adjusting to life. And my family was able to overcome that with the generosity of wonderful and great Americans. And I'll cite one example. When I got here, I prioritized learning English, my first priority. And I enrolled in the GED program. And through my first job as a custodian at the Louisiana State University College, LSU, I'm a Tiger fan. And there I learned the American football. But my supervisor at that time, she's an American, adopted me as a son and showed me the different programs that are there at LSU, being I was working there. And I was able to be at work and do my GED and got my GED. And then that get my GED means so much to me. And then the next step, the same lady encourages me to get to college. I enroll in community college. My very first semester, I experienced one of, I would say it's a bittersweet when I'm faced with bullying and discrimination. Sometimes when we talk about bullying, we talked about students doing it to other students. But this was the professor. I came from a country where the tradition, you respect teachers and respect them. And I couldn't respond. Instead of calling my name, like everyone is calling it for here, Dauda, 2 syllables, or call my last name, Cisse. In as much as I showed the teacher how to pronounce my name, and I even said, okay, you know what? Dauda means David. Call me David. But instead chooses to call me the slave boy, Kunta Kinte. This is where I felt most welcome when my fellow classmates stood up on my behalf and reported that issue to the dean. One day I walked in class, I almost dropped out And I know what that education meant to me, to become the first person in my family to get a college degree. Something my dad invested so much before he was taken away. That's what it meant to me. I walked in that class and I saw the dean and I saw my fellow students, and they said, Dauda, don't be afraid. We already told the dean what happened. And I looked, over 20 plus students, one professor. And then they gave me a voice. And I learned that what is happening, some of the dangerous rhetoric does not represent the whole of this country. And I saw that generosity firsthand. So if you ask me, and that's just one I wanted to share, so many.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your service, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the chance to question and participate. I look forward to working with both of you as we try to solve this challenging problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday, Mr. Chairman. And I understand you chaired 2 judiciary hearings today. Is that right? You're quite busy. And Senator Cornyn, thank you as well. My state, we are very proud of our long tradition of welcoming immigrants and refugees. Our state has the largest Somali and Oromo populations in the U.S., second largest Hmong population, only to California, and the largest Liberian population, 30,000 Liberians in Minnesota. Our state also has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. We have per capita, one of the highest numbers of Fortune 500 companies, depending on the years, 17, 18, 19 of them. And so much of that, when you look at our country and who is running companies right now or starting companies, and who the numbers of people who won U.S. Nobel laureates, you see immigrants and refugees throughout. So I am obsessed with our workforce issue right now. I'm not going to double down on that because I want to talk about the Afghan Adjustment Act. But without refugees and immigrants, we're not going to maintain the competitive edge that has helped us. And that's why I want to pass either comprehensive immigration reform or at least do something when it comes to the dreamers and temporary status people and add that into the workforce permits, visas, work on the border combined. I just believe that if we don't do something here, when I look at our rural hospitals and doctors that are from other countries, when I look at our hospitality industry, ag industry, we need the workers. So that's where my mind is, but my heart is also with our refugees. And more than 75,000 Afghans who have taken refuge in our country, they're currently in limbo. That's why Senator Graham, the ranking member of this committee, and I joined forces with Senator Coons, Moran, Wicker. These are the lead Republicans on the Veterans Affairs and the Armed Services Committee. Blumenthal, Shaheen, Murkowski, and many other supporters are leading the effort to pass a bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act to allow Afghans who undergo additional vetting, which is very important to a number of our co-sponsors, that you see this as actually a plus, not only for our country, not only for our reputation in the world, when half of them at least have letters from the chief of mission in Afghanistan for helping our military, whether as translators, security, and the like. So would have a streamlined pathway to a green card. I know that, Mr. Kinney, your organization, as well as the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we have 40 organizations, including the VFW and the American Legion, supporting this bill. It's a huge priority of former President Bush. Can you talk about how our bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act would help the more than 75,000 Afghans who are currently living in limbo?
Sure. Thank you, Senator, and also for your leadership in this particular area. Every day that an Afghan who we evacuated into the country and did an excellent job, both our multiple government agencies, our communities, and our nonprofits, including our own, who work together on the safe havens, to welcome them should be commended for that work. At the same time, while we have these folks integrating into our societies and cities and counties and finding work and starting lives, every day that they're not secure by having a path to citizenship, or at least a path to permanent residency in this country, they are living in an insecure environment, and it certainly has to be affecting their mental health. In fact, I'm sure it is. I talked to many of them. So this act is critical to securing their place in this country. We cannot send these people back to Afghanistan. We know what's happening with the Taliban. I met many, many young women who were well educated from Afghanistan who came through the evacuation. They cannot go back to Afghanistan. There isn't enough legal assistance there to assist them. The passage of this act, I feel, is common sense and imperative to those who are here and to those tens of thousands that we hope to also bring forward from places like Pakistan, which we discussed earlier.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And by the way, thank you for your personal story. We are devoted to moving this bill ahead on behalf of those that have stood with our country. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Corn, let's proceed with the second round of questions. I know I have a few more, and I imagine you might as well. One aspect of the U.S. refugee admissions program that is particularly troubling is how long it can take someone to get through the entire referral and resettlement process, 2 different stages of it. These people are literally fleeing from wars, environmental disasters, and persecution, and yet it can still take years for them to find a new, safe home in the United States. The State Department has set a goal to try and process and resettle refugees within 6 months from the time they are referred to the program, but currently it's taken 3 to 4 years, sometimes longer. Mr. Sisse, you spent almost 10 years in a refugee camp waiting to be resettled. Can you just describe for the committee what that experience was like, what your time there in the refugee camp was like?
Thank you so much, Senator Padilla, and thanks for this hearing today. As I mentioned earlier in my opening, life in the refugee camp is very tough. And I remember when I got into the Gambia and in the refugee camp right in Basse. The camp doesn't have any dedicated place to use when you wanted to go to the toilet. And sometimes we wait at night for you to take a shower when it's dark. And you live in a space about the size of from here to there. You get over 10 to 20 people lived in that space, and it's opened. And the worst part, especially during the raining season, when it rains, imagine you go further down and you use it, a camp that is filled with people. And during raining season, all the smell, the toilet, it's coming back where individuals are living. And at that time, they are adjacent, not too far from the camp. There was war going on, the Casamas by Senegal's border. So you run from a war, and then close to the border, there's instability going. And then the host nation, they already have their own situation. So yes, this takes us to some of the reasons why you see individuals are finding other ways to seek safety because of the conditions in the camp and the time it took.
And I'm sure, sorry to interrupt, but there's another question I want to ask you, but Appreciate you sharing, because again, I know it was not easy and it's still not easy, but for all the reasons we may think of how we can and should accelerate the time that it takes, the experiences that you're sharing should remind us or give us additional reason and motivation to move that process along more expeditiously. I asked you the question about what it was like while you were waiting. I want to ask my next question of what it was like once you came to the United States. And particularly, you shared some good stories, some not so friendly stories about that time period of integrating, some welcoming families, an instructor who was not very proper. I'll leave it at that. What are some of the biggest integration barriers that you think that refugees face when they arrive into the United States, and how can the federal government address those barriers or challenges so that when refugees do arrive, they integrate more quickly and successfully and can thrive more quickly?
Thank you so much. And in my personal experience, the first thing is language barrier, communication, because it is key. And then also having a structure in place where especially those that come here with little children. Like, I came here with my wife, and my daughter was 6 months old. What it takes away the family dynamics. If I had to go to work during the day, she looks at the child. And then when I come home, she has to go to work. Refugee like us, we wanted to give back in the community, and we wanted to get to self-sufficiency. And I believe access to childcare, access to safe and affordable homes, access to an opportunity for you to go learn English, and then having a child care in that process. And I think that goes a long way to help us integrate, and at the same time able to contribute back to the nation that gave us this opportunity. And finally, I would say the refugee program, yes, needs to be protected. And then we saw within the last 5 years how that infrastructure has been damaged. And I know personally in Louisiana, career social worker that help refugees and others like us integrate. Majority of those, they lose their job because of the low numbers that are coming up. And I believe that low number is so critical. And if Congress can pass either a bill or legislation to have a minimum cap of the presidential determination, that will help, because once we have that minimum caps, we know when the number went to below 15,000 or 15,000, we saw how those infrastructure in Louisiana, we have refugees resettlement stations that closed. Secondly, let's have an equitable pathway to protections. We all see what is happening in Ukraine, and then we saw the response of the administrations. That response can be leveraged across other nationalities as well. What happens to me, it's similar that I'm seeing that is happening in Ukraine. What is happening in the DRC Congo, it's not that much different. What is happening in Ukraine, what happened to the Afghanistan is not different. What is happening in those other parts of the world, including Mali right now. And I believe that equitable pathway to protection will go a long way in protecting that infrastructure in the system.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's why we're here. How do we improve the system? I'll just note before recognizing Senator Cornyn for additional questions. It's a challenge enough for federal, state, and local governments to help address the housing affordability concern. Imagine it's, or we recognize that it's particularly difficult for refugees. Access to quality, affordable childcare is a concern for everybody, but again, particularly difficult for refugees. So we have a lot of work to do. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Kenney, I believe it was in 2016 when you had previously testified about the small number of religious minorities subjected to persecution, that the relatively small number were resettled in the United States that fiscal year. And I believe it was 2016, you said you focused especially on the plight of Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East. And of course, in my opening comments, I talked about the Uyghurs and the People's Republic of China, about 1 million Muslim Uyghurs who are essentially held in concentration camps. The previous administration had an entire category of refugee admissions focused on victims of religious persecution. A recent article in the National Catholic Register described Nigeria, for example, as an epicenter of anti-Christian violence, with 5,014 Christians killed in 2022 alone, nearly 90% of the total number of Christians killed worldwide. Do you think a category for religious persecution would be helpful as opposed to just a geographical or country approach?
I think it's worthy to consider, but as we know, for the refugee admission at large, religious persecution is a category. I think what would be as important is to assure that our adjudication officers are well, this is part of their training to be able to identify and be sensitive to religious persecution, as you note, is happening in many places around the world, Christians and others alike. So I think that it's worth examining the category, but perhaps most importantly, sensitizing our personnel that are out there adjudicating cases and keeping an eye on religious persecution as a specific category.
General Burns, speaking of the Afghan Adjustment Act now, the Inspector General of both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense have both published reports finding that during Operation Allies Welcome, Afghans who were either not fully vetted or who were later found to have derogatory information in their background had been paroled into the United States. Do you think the manner in which the Operation Allies Welcome was conducted could potentially pose a national security risk as opposed to having that vetting occur outside of the country?
I think it goes to my former comments on we just have to have a consistent vetting process that's outside the country that goes through all that process. And I think what we need is, and hopefully it'll happen, is innovation occurs. We'll be able to start to integrate in the different systems between DHS, DOD, and everybody else as well to get to the speed, so that way you're not waiting a long time. Because we have to maintain security for stability, but we also have to need to pick it up a little bit, and hopefully innovation will do that. And I think also, frankly, funding the right programs between CBP and the different agencies so that way they can do it. Because the size and these crises unfortunately keep happening. As you were commenting earlier about refugees, all I could think and hope for after 36 years of service is actually not having the best year of refugees coming out. That's not a good thing. I would like to see the lowest. And unfortunately, we don't have systems right now to vet to the depth that we need with the amount of refugees that we have, as well as everybody else. But that was definitely a concern. And again, it's that speed and security thing. We were in a very difficult situation in Afghanistan, getting people out, and we needed to kind of position someplace else and then migrate them in after the rigorous vetting and having a standard process that we follow.
And finally, Mr. Kenney, you said you weren't familiar necessarily with the rule that the Biden administration is working on or promulgated for people claiming asylum. But I think, generally speaking, it could be described as a way to encourage people to apply outside of the United States and not then have to wait in the interior of the United States for the process to conclude. As you know, there was a Remain in Mexico protocol, but under the previous administration. But I can tell you based on the recent trip that Senator Welch and Senator Coons and I took to Mexico, they've got their own challenges because they can't accommodate a whole lot of people there. So, but they're happy to have them move on into the United States, so they're out of there. They're no longer a concern of theirs. But as a general matter, do you think it makes sense to vet asylum asylees outside of the United States if it can be done so, like applying through a consulate in their home country, if that's possible?
Well, then they would, yes, I do. They would then be refugees. They wouldn't be asylum seekers.
Yeah, that's another part of the confusing nomenclature here, because essentially, as I understand, the legal standard is the same, virtually the same for refugees or asylees, but if you apply for the refugee program, you're subject to a cap in this vetting. If you show up on our border and claim asylum, none of that applies. And I think the Biden administration is trying to figure out how do we deal with the humanitarian and public security crisis that we have on our border. But again, to your point, they become refugees, not asylees, if they do it from their home country.
I do believe that the more processing centers that we can put into the Southern Hemisphere to deal with some of these situations would be helpful to all involved, both for, those who are leaving these countries so quickly and due to the situation. Haiti is a very good example. If we can get some refugee processing centers out there and go out and adjudicate, along with keeping, our international obligations and national obligations to welcome asylum seekers when they come to our border or to give them a chance, I think we can do both better.
We no doubt can do better than the status quo. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. One last question before we begin to adjourn here today. Coming back to Mr. Kenny. Now, we hear from employers all the time that the labor market is tight and it is challenging for them to find workers. We have a workforce shortage in America. At the same time, the unemployment rate is currently at 3.6%. And refugees who are able to come to the United States help fill an important labor shortage gap in communities across the United States and in a number of important sectors of our economy. In fact, the 2017 study conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services found that refugees contributed $269 billion in revenue between 2005 and 2014, with a net fiscal impact of $63 billion, meaning that they generated more revenue for the United States than the amount spent on them by the government. I believe Senator Whitehouse referred to this data as well when he was present earlier. Sure wish we would have heard more about that study that was conducted in 2017, but regardless, the data is the data. Again, there's a chart demonstrating this behind me. Question for Mr. Kenny. In your experience leading one of the largest resettlement agencies in the United States, can you share your experience, how easy or difficult it is to assist refugees in finding employment, and what recommendations you may have to help us, help you, help refugees?
Historically, not difficult to help refugees find employment for a variety of reasons, largely because they come and they want to contribute and they want to work. The current program run by State Department and ORR puts a premium on refugees finding employment and puts a premium on the resettlement agencies. It's a primary goal to actually help them find employment. After some 90 days, about 32% of refugees are employed. After 8 months, our experience is that 80% of employable refugees are employed, and they are employed to the extent that they can not only provide for themselves, but be ineligible for public grants, such as TANF. So after 8 months, 80% of the refugees that we work with find employment. Various industries, agriculture, meatpacking, retail. I just, again, as I frequently do, had a Uber ride from a refugee. So the ability to help them find work is there. The one thing that I would say is we have to look for ways to follow them longer in their employability. In other words, not just get them their first job, but look at ways that we can help them develop their careers. So programs that can do that. And again, our refugee support tends to be a bit shorter than longer. Programs that can help them deal with English language, learn English for longer periods, and then develop their career over longer periods, I think would be beneficial to refugees and our communities.
Thank you so much. I'll have to follow up on that topic and many others. But I think at this point we'll begin to move towards adjournment of the hearing. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, you heard from a couple of my colleagues that, yes, today is my birthday. Last year, 1 year ago today, it was day one, if I recall, of the confirmation hearing for now Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And my sons at the time said, if you're not home for your birthday, Dad, you better have a good reason. I think we had a great reason last year. We have a very good reason here today. We'll wait for the weekend to blow out some candles. But thank you all for your participation. I do want to take this moment to enter a number of statements into the record, including statements from CHRLA, from Church World Service, from HIAS, from the International Refugee Assistance Project, from Kids in Need of Defense, Lawyers for Good Government, from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, from Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, from the National Immigration Forum, from the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, from Refugee Advocacy Lab, from Refugee Congress, from Refugees International, from Talent Beyond Boundaries, from the Episcopal Church, and from Voice for Refuge. Without objection, these statements will be included. Also, to announce to everybody, the record will close 1 week from today. I once again thank Ranking Member Cornyn and his staff, along with Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Graham, and their staff, as well as all of our fellow committee members for helping with the success of today's hearing. I thank again our witnesses for joining us today and for sharing your stories, your experience, and your expertise. What we heard today should be a hopeful reminder of the opportunity that the United States of America still represents to millions around the globe, but should also be an urgent call to action, because for all that our nation represents, we are at risk of falling short of our ideals and our needs. We can see that while the number of refugees worldwide is skyrocketing, our nation's admissions numbers have plummeted as a result of the policies of the prior administration, as well as due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet as we work to build back from COVID-19 and from the prior administration, the Biden administration is working hard to return to a standard fitting our nation. And there should be no reason why we can't find common ground and ensure the refugee program has the resources it needs to fulfill its mission. I also want to take a moment to emphasize a distinction that we discussed several times during today's hearing. There is a U.S. refugee admissions program, which was the focus of today's hearing. Separately, there's the asylum system. Now, both programs are life-saving programs, but they are separate and distinct, and both need our support to ensure that we can address the rise in displacement we are witnessing around the world, including for the 103 million who cannot safely return home. I do think it is important to underscore that refugees are one of the most thoroughly vetted groups of immigrants in the country. Another chart behind me to help drive home the point. Just a small flavor of the many, many steps, rigorous steps that refugees go through before they can enter the United States. I'll also acknowledge that a former National Security Council senior director for the Trump administration for a year and a half put it this way, and I'll quote, "I did used to think that the refugee program was vulnerable to terrorist infiltration, but then I got here and made it my business to learn the facts about the program. And now I know that refugees are the most vetted category of any immigrant." End quote. She went on to say, again, I'll quote, "You'd be crazy to come if you were a terrorist. This is the last way you would try to get into this country." End quote. So this debate is not about security. As a country, we've taken painstaking steps to ensure refugees are thoroughly vetted before entry. Instead, this discussion is about our ability to live up to our founding ideals and to welcome those in need with humanity. We can and must do better. Better for people just like Mr. Sase, who have credible fear of persecution at home, but must still wait years in a refugee camp fighting for better living conditions before they can ever reach their new home. And we must do better for the many Americans who want to help in refugee resettlement efforts, who take their moral duty as Americans and as human beings seriously by trying to lift up and help refugees who dream of living free in the United States of America. I believe we can and must work together in a bipartisan way, as has been done in the past, to improve our immigration system so more people have the opportunity to utilize the refugee admissions process. I thank you all again for your participation today, to our witnesses, and to my colleagues for joining us. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.